Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Bernstein, the president of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. Today is the second and final part of our live program on Israel's elections and their impact on Israeli society, the American Jewish community, and Jews worldwide. Our program is presented by the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue Israel Committee with the generous support of the Schwartz Israel Fund. I want to thank all the members of our Israel Committee, and in particular the chairs of the committee, Shula Bahat and Arthur Stein, for organizing today's program. It's now my honor to introduce our two distinguished speakers, Ambassador Ido Aharoni and Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. Ambassador Aharoni was Israel's longest serving consul general in New York and the tri-state area. He held that position with the rank of ambassador for 6 years, overseeing the operations of Israel's largest global diplomatic mission. Ambassador Aharoni is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and since his retirement, he now serves as Global Distinguished Professor for International Relations at NYU's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He's a co-founder of Emerson Rigby Limited, a member of the International Advisory Council of APCO Worldwide, a managing director at private investment firm ValueBase, a global ambassador for Maccabi World Union, and the chairman of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy. The bottom line is he's a busy guy, and we are privileged to have him here with us today. Rabbi Hirsch, our senior rabbi at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, is 1 in a million. The Jerusalem Post named him in the 50 most influential Jews of the year in 2018, and the City and State New York Magazine has praised him as the borough's most influential voice for Manhattan's more than 300,000 Jews. He was executive director of the Association of Reform Zionists of America, ARZA, for 12 years, and from 1977 to 1980, Rabbi Hirsch, our own Rabbi Hirsch, served as a tank commander in the Israel Defense Forces. I'm going to have you guys take it away. I want to remind folks that they can ask questions throughout this using the Q&A function, not the chat function. You can chat amongst yourselves, but use the Q&A function for any questions. And with that, Rabbi, Ambassador, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm just going to take 30 seconds of rabbinic prerogative and thank Mark for all of his years of service with us. Mark is currently the president, fantastic, great president. And will be concluding his service in the next couple of months. So Mark, on behalf of all of us, the trustees and the synagogue, thank you for this extraordinary contribution to not only to our synagogue, but to Jewish life. Ambassador Aharoni, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Rabbi. I'd like to join you in thanking Mark for his very gracious introduction.
Thank you. You've set the community on fire. We've been talking about your words nonstop since we met you 3 weeks ago or so. Let me get straight to it. Last time we met was 2 days before the elections. We were talking about some of the various scenarios that you think might develop. One of the scenarios that you said was likely is that there would likely be a deadlock by the end of Tuesday voting. So what happened? Where are we, and where do you think we're going?
So the bottom line is, it looks like we're going for another round, and the reason is because of the main takeaway from the fourth round, which is that Israel right now is experiencing its worst constitutional crisis ever. And what does it mean? It means that the Israeli electoral system, which is highly fragmented. We have 12 political parties that passed the threshold and are now being represented in the Knesset. 12 political parties, it's a lot. And the main takeaway is that electoral system is unable to produce a resolution, which means the country is not being governed. Now, this has devastating implications for the nation. For example, we don't have a budget. And the budget is basically the main tool of the government to govern. It's the business plan. Imagine a business that runs without a business plan. Now, you can't do that when you run such a highly complex, massive economy like the Israeli economy. Appointments. One of the key appointments in Israeli cabinet is the Ministry of Justice. There is no Minister of Justice. As a result, many appointments in the law enforcement and the legal system are stuck. We have in the Foreign Service tens of diplomatic appointments that were put on a freeze, including the Consul General position here in New York. And so the implications are devastating. And so what will solve the constitutional crisis? We don't know. The second takeaway is that it's all about Netanyahu. So if Netanyahu was to step down, there would be a government in a matter of days, which means that this is really about him, about his style of leadership. He has been unable to form a coalition 4 times in a row. The reason why he was able to form coalition after the third round is because his main rival bailed him out because of the COVID-19 crisis and so on. So he's been unable to form a coalition, a narrow Likud-led coalition. So that's the second, takeaway from what's happening is Netanyahu, there's no reason to believe that he will be able to form a narrow coalition after the 5th round.
So just to go into just a little more detail. So the president gave Netanyahu the mandate to try and form a coalition. That's a 28-day period with a possible extension of 14 days. And then you do not expect the prime minister to be able to form a coalition, whatever that period may be, if I understand your response, or it's less likely. And then what do you think will happen if in fact he's unable to form a coalition?
So first of all, the reason why he is unable to form a coalition is because even if you include Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, he doesn't have 61 without the support of the Arabs. Now, before the elections, Netanyahu, from his point of view, from his political camp's point of view, made a huge strategic gamble, which turned out to be a strategic mistake. And he courted the Arab factions. Now, there are 3 or 4 different Arab factions. It depends how you look at them. The most radical Arab faction, called Ram, is affiliated ideologically and religiously with the Islamic Brothers in Egypt, very close ties with Hamas in Gaza. And he flirted with them, and now he's openly courting them to join the government, or at least to support the government from the outside, which would give him the ability to govern. Now, even if he's able to form such a coalition, it's not going to be, it will not survive for long. But what happened in the process is 2 things. The first is he enraged the Israeli right wing, which is now opposing the very idea of bringing, or at least using, the Arab support to form a coalition. Of course, there's going to be a price for that support, budgets. And again, I'll be the last person to oppose more budgets for the Arab sector. I'm just saying it created for Netanyahu a huge political problem, which is a self-inflicted political problem. By the way, most of his people tell me we are amazed of his political skill. It's true. He's an amazing political tactician. And his maneuverability, his political ability to maneuver is just incredible. The problem is that he is deploying this incredible capability to get himself out of problems that he himself created. So the first problem that he created is the fact that he legitimized the most radical Arab faction, de facto de-weaponizing them, allowing his opposition now to use it, meaning there is a scenario that if Yair Lapid, who's the second in line to receive the mandate from the president, will receive the mandate, he will feel free to invite the Arabs into his coalition because Netanyahu legitimized them. So that's the first strategic mistake that he made. The second was that he alienated Avigdor Lieberman. By doing so, he broke the traditional division within Israeli political system between right and left, because Avigdor Lieberman is a different kind of right. He is right on geopolitical issues, is right on the conflict, maybe right on the economy, but is very much to the left on social issues and on religious issues. So Netanyahu himself broke his own political bloc. And that's a huge strategic mistake because, again, the fact that Lieberman came out against Netanyahu and joined the pro-change bloc allowed others like Gideon Sa'ar, gave them the confidence to do the same. And interestingly, the three leaders of the political parties that challenge Netanyahu and are openly interested in unseating him, Lieberman, Sa'ar, and Bennett, although he will not say so publicly, but certainly he is very much committed to replace Netanyahu. All three of them used to work with Netanyahu at one point or another, especially Avigdor Lieberman, who was the chief architect of Netanyahu's entrance into the political arena in Israel.
So you said the prospects are not great that Netanyahu will be able to form a government, but even if he does, it's likely to be a fairly weak government and probably won't last too long. Is it the same if the mandate is transferred to Lapid? What are the chances of him being able to form a government, and how viable will that coalition be? And if the result of all this is fifth elections, what gives anybody any kind of optimism that the results will be different after 5 times?
Yeah, they won't be different. And a lot of people, as a result, and this is the third main takeaway from the elections, is that the mistrust that the Israeli voter developed for the Israeli political system is unprecedented. And it puts the Israeli democracy in a very dangerous place. When there is no trust, you end up like those countries in Latin America or like those countries in Africa. When there is no trust, there is no accountability. There is no rule of law. And that's when the system begins to disintegrate and even implode. And that's what the people that really care about the system. Now, the average Israeli, they don't really follow, just like the average American, they don't really follow the details of every political scandal. Most Israelis don't follow the negotiations. Most Israelis don't follow even the trial that was resumed on April 5th, the prime minister's trial. And so, less and less Israelis want to participate in this, what became routine elections. And so Israeli democracy is in a very dangerous place right now. So my projection is that if there's going to be a 5th round, you'll see even further erosion of Israeli trust in their system.
So presumably lots of people know this, lots of people are fearful of this, including members of Knesset. And if what you said is correct, that the major impediment here is the prime minister himself, why, and that if he were somehow removed from the scene, there could be very quickly a stable and large government. Why aren't others? I can understand the prime minister not wanting to leave office, but why aren't the others putting pressure rather than sending Israel on this very dangerous path?
Excellent question. And I think the answer is that Likud is the Holy Grail. The reason why they don't want to come out, and I mean, some of them did, like Lieberman and Sa'ar, and what Gideon Sa'ar did was very courageous, very courageous. They're afraid to alienate the base. Now, a lot of people claim that the base in Israel is largely imaginary, fictitious almost, in the sense that Likud under Netanyahu, and I think we mentioned it the first time we spoke about the elections, actually underperforming, severely underperforming. If you imagine if Menachem Begin was the leader of Likud today, they would get easy 50 seats with all the vaccinations and COVID, or if Ariel Sharon was the head of Likud today, they'll get 55 seats. I mean, Netanyahu as the leader of Likud won as little as 12 seats, I think, and 19 seats at one point. So Likud, is underperforming, but is the strongest political brand in Israel's history, maybe second only to Labor that founded the country. But today, certainly, the strongest brand name in Israeli politics is Likud. So all the challengers, they're eyeing the Holy Grail. That's the reason why they're very, very careful not to attack Netanyahu, not to agitate and anger the political base, the hardcore of Likud supporters. That's the main reason. Now, I haven't studied the Israeli voter. I'm not sure that the political base is so loyal to Netanyahu himself. I have a feeling that their loyalty is to Likud. In other words, Likud is stronger. Brand Likud is stronger, much stronger than brand Netanyahu. For example, all the people that I know that voted for Likud, and I know quite a few, voted for Likud despite of Netanyahu, not because of Netanyahu.
Let me ask you one more question on this, in this regard. Tell us a little bit about the trial and Netanyahu's trial, which started recently, and that is a big part of this equation. The prime minister recently said, in trying to combat public opinion and the evidence coming out in the trial, which, even though it's at a very early stage, is quite damaging. And he was quoted as saying, "This is what a coup looks like." Do you agree with the prime minister? What is the role of the trial in all of this? And I just happened to see today, I don't know if you caught it yet, Ido, that I think just this morning, the High Court actually ruled in his favor in not preventing. He's entitled to form of government.
Right. So in Israel, the most sacred right from a legal point of view is the right to be elected. So even if you committed a crime and you spent time in prison, you were charged and convicted, you are allowed to be elected, which is not something that exists in every country in the world. In the United States, for example, if you're a convicted felon, there are many restrictions. In Israel, we have a minister, one of the most important cabinet members, Derry, who is a convicted felon, spent time in prison. Now, I think we Israelis, we shouldn't be happy about it, but we should be proud and celebrate the fact that our system is able to produce, whenever is necessary, the right. We sent a president, an ex-president to jail, an ex-prime minister to jail, and almost every ministry in the cabinet, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Interior, all those folks, one way or another, found themselves in jail because they violated the law. So there's a very strong statement here that the Israeli system may be very slow digesting legal cases and legal claims and legal accusations, but at the end of the day, it does have the ability to produce. And I think that there's very little evidence in Netanyahu's own behavior, and I say this with great sadness. I don't think we need to see another prime minister in jail. I will be deeply saddened by it as an individual, and I happen to like him, by the way, personally. But there are no indications in his behavior that tell us, the Israeli public, that he himself is convinced of his innocence. Zero indication, by the way. The way he behaves gives us exactly the opposite indication, that he is pretty much convinced that he's going to be convicted, and therefore he is determined to do all the things that he does. And I think that's a pretty powerful statement that he's making to the Israeli public.
Can you just, in a nutshell, very briefly, explain to the American audience that is not following the trial day to day, in a nutshell, what are these cases about?
Yeah, a lot of people tell me, there's a few cigars and champagne. What are you talking about? This is a joke. Well, people have to understand the difference between the Israeli system and the American system. It's a systemic difference. In Israel, there is no immunity. I mean, you do get an immunity as a member of Knesset, as a legislator, just in the context of performing your own job. But from a legal point of view, the prime minister of Israel, first of all, is not the commander in chief. He's not even the diplomat in chief. He's not the head of the army. He is, from a legal point of view, first among equals. What does it mean? It means that the prime minister is being upheld to a much higher standard legally than the average citizen. So you're under scrutiny. It's not like in the United States that the president enjoys all-encompassing immunity. It's not the case in Israel. So that's the first thing to understand. Secondly, he's being accused of three things in three different cases. The first is receiving an overwhelming, excessive number of gifts, demanding those gifts. This is the least severe cases, but the easiest to prove in court because everything is documented. The second is a bribery case where he is being accused of changing regulation in favor of one company and in return demanding positive coverage in one of the entities that this company controlled. And the regulatory advantage that he gave the company is estimated in the billions of shekels. That's a very serious allegation. A lot of people think it would be very difficult to prove that he received something in return for the regulatory changes. But that was the first testimonies that we heard on April 5th. The CEO of that media organization actually detailed a very, very long list of incidents. So that's going on. So this is a clear bribery case. And the third case is the intent to commit bribery, which is his willingness to pass legislation in the Israeli parliament to favor one media organization over another. The media organization that he wanted to favor promised him in a recorded phone call that they would improve their coverage of his efforts to be reelected. And interestingly enough, the media organization that stood to be disadvantaged by this new legislation was the media organization that the late Sheldon Adelson actually created to help Netanyahu. So not only that, he's being accused of the intention to commit bribery. From a public point of view, this is a pretty bad case of disloyalty to your number one supporter, Sheldon Adelson. And again, most Israelis are not familiar with the details of what I'm telling you, but those who are familiar think that this is a very, very serious trial and that he's being accused of extremely serious crimes in Israeli political system. And there's a reason why the Attorney General, Mr. Mendelblit, took the step to make those allegations public. He shared them with the public in a very detailed 65-page document because he wanted to make sure that the Israelis have the opportunity to know exactly why he chose to take this extreme step of pressing charges against the prime minister.
So I take it we don't have to worry about a judicial coup that's seeking to overturn the will of the people in this respect, that these are very serious crimes.
And I can make a projection.
Allegations.
There'll be no January 6th in Israel if Netanyahu is convicted. I can promise you that. There'll be no January 6th.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the last time, and you were correct about that in terms of we were worried that the people who didn't get the outcome they thought in the elections might try to pull a Trump and claim that the elections were rigged or so on. And you were quite insistent that that wouldn't happen in Israel back at the time.
Not only that, Shelo leshma leshma, I believe in the theory of unintended consequence. So Netanyahu actually did something great from an historical point of view. When he legitimized the most radical Arab faction, he also legitimized the rest of the Arabs. So he actually, and he may be remembered in history for doing that. Basically allowing the Arabs to enter the mainstream of Israeli politics, which will give them access to budgets, will give them access to many other things. And I think it's very good news for Israeli economy. I think it's very good news for Israeli society. After all, the overwhelming majority of Israeli Arabs are actually very proud to to be Israeli. Every social study shows that. And they have all the reasons in the world. Their GDP per capita, per annum is higher than most Arab countries. Their level of education is higher. Their life expectancy is higher. So the Arab Israelis are, they want to be part of Israeli society. It's about the Jews that should let them in.
I want to remind everybody who's listening, if you want to send in a question, send it in to the Q&A. And I have so many questions here that I need to get to, but if we have time, we'll certainly pick up on that. So don't hesitate. One question, Ido, on COVID. Of course, we're following the exceptional, relative to the rest of the world, the exceptional results in Israel. It's something, what is happening in Israel is kind of a leading indicator of what may be around the world. When you reach these levels of vaccination, there's still a ways to go in Israel as well. But I think this week the mask mandate in public was removed, and so we can really we can be optimistic. And in this respect, I want to ask you, in terms of the instability that we talked about before and the lack of good governance as a result of this political instability. There were reports recently that Pfizer threatened to delay another shipment of vaccines to Israel because Israel was refusing to pay, and Pfizer, and there were even reports that suggested that Pfizer thought that Israel was acting like a banana republic. Are you familiar with this at all? And is there anything you can share with us?
Yeah. So first of all, groups can enter Israel beginning May 23rd of people who were vaccinated. To your question, so Israel, so first of all, our viewers should know the United States dominates, the American regulator dominates the allocation of the vaccines. Why? Because the main leading companies that produce the vaccinations are all American companies under the regulation of the FDA, and many of them received very generous grants from the NIH and others to, not only to work on the vaccine, but also in previous life, when they worked on other medical breakthroughs. So it's up to the United States, and I've heard it from, the top people in my own ears. The United States made the decision, not Pfizer, to provide Israel with the vaccinations. Israel was chosen to be the first national beta site because of its size and because of the decision of the American regulator. This has to be understood. If not, without the approval of the American administration, this would not have happened. You have countries like South Africa that did not receive the vaccinations yet, or countries like Brazil. And so what happened was that Israel was chosen as the beta site, and the experiment is successful, succeeded, meaning the vaccine is working in a big way, And so this is where we are. Now the question is, when should we get the second round? That's the big question. Israel has 4 HMOs. In Israel, healthcare is universal. There's universal healthcare. So between the 4 HMOs, the Israeli system knows how to communicate with each and every Israeli. Doesn't matter whether you're an Arab or a Bedouin or a Jew, it doesn't matter. Christian, we know how to, every person that lives in Israel, that Israel is his place of residence or her place of residence, we can communicate with them. That makes Israel a very easy country to deal with. Now, the big question is, when do we need the second round? So there was an argument whether it's going to be after 6 months, meaning in this coming July, or we just heard from the CEO of Pfizer that they think that this would be valid for the full year, meaning we can wait until the next January or next February of 2022. That's the question. We don't have any problem of purchasing. Israel paid very handsomely for the vaccinations. And again, it's a question of international distribution. If indeed the second round of vaccinations will be required only after a year and not after 6 months, there is no problem. But if we need them immediately, there may be a problem of shortages. And that's the main issue that you read about.
So what was the accusation of refusal to pay? Was that just made up? Was that grounded
I
in
don't know,
something?
probably a spin. I find it hard to believe that Israel refused to pay. Israel, and again, it's not even being, the HMOs in Israel have a long-standing relationships with all the leading manufacturers of medications in the world. So they really didn't need the intervention of, the Israeli HMOs. They know Pfizer, they know Moderna. I myself spoke with the leadership of both companies. And, the chief medical officer of Moderna is Israeli. His name is Tal Sachs. And they know the Israelis, they deal with Israelis all the time, routinely, with all the 4 HMOs. The 2 largest HMOs are Clalit and Maccabi. And between the 2 of them, you're covering 60, 70% of the Israeli population. So I wouldn't worry about it. I think that Israel's case should make all of us very optimistic about the ability of the vaccinations to solve the problem.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Iran, if you can shed some light for us. First of all, what happened last week at Natanz, at the Iranian nuclear facility, and what is the impact of what happened on the talks in Vienna? It seems clear to lay observers, at least, that the Americans are interested in returning to the JCPOA. The EU is certainly interested in doing it. And so what is the connection? What happened last week? I think it was a week ago or so in the Iranian facility. And does that have any impact on the talks?
So there were hints planted by Israeli leaders, including the prime minister himself, that Israel supposedly had something to do with it. But, we're not in any position to verify or deny. What I would say is this: it's no secret that the conflict between Israelis and Iranians, between Israel, the Israeli government, and the Iranian government, it's not between the peoples, can no longer be described as Cold War. It's out there already in the open. And the conflict is obviously over a very, very significant thing for Israel, which is losing its competitive edge. Right? Israel is adamant and is determined not to let other countries to have nuclear military capabilities, especially a country that is openly talking about annihilating Israel and routinely denies the Holocaust, which is a very sensitive thing for every Israeli and every Jew. So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing an actual war between 2 countries. The United States believes that what is needed at this point is engagement rather than disengagement. And this is what you're seeing. Now, I believe that the Israeli government, at least the current Israeli government, will continue in its efforts to convince the Biden administration that engagement has fully exhausted itself as a diplomatic strategy vis-a-vis the Iranians. In other words, we've tried to engage them before, doesn't work. The only thing that works with the Iranians is tough economic sanctions, a credible military threat on the table. And I think that the Saudis also will join the Israelis in making the same points. However, Biden is for his part, he's determined to go back to diplomacy. And we see it also, it's in line with other decisions that the president made, for example, to withdraw from Afghanistan, not even, leaving a limited number of troops on the ground. So he is going back to diplomacy, international diplomacy, in a very big way. And I have to say, it also makes sense because of COVID-19. We spoke about COVID-19, comparing COVID-19 crisis to the recovery of the world from World War II. In both cases, what we saw was a huge return to diplomacy and international collaboration. So I think this is the ideology and the worldview of the Biden administration. And as long as this is the government in Israel, we are going to have a disagreement on this issue, and it's going to be a very serious disagreement.
When you say as long as we have this government, share with us, give us a sense of, is there a consensus in Israel, one, that Iran is an existential threat, and two, that the JCPOA, the agreement, is problematic, and so that any government that was in power in Israel would still have tensions with the American administration?
Yeah, so in the political system, I could say that there is a consensus that that the JCPOA was not a good agreement. Yeah, I could say that. I think Yair Lapid joins that, Benny Gantz, and the opposition also.
Can you say why, just in very briefly?
Yeah, I'll explain. So at the core is, again, just as I described the differences between the legal systems and the electoral systems, there's also a difference in the defense philosophy. In Israel, when you look, and I don't know if we had the chance to discuss this last time, but when you look at the way countries devise their own national security strategy, it's usually based on three elements when you think of your enemies. Based on identifying your enemy's motivation, your enemy's military capabilities, the means to carry out their plans, and the opportunity to attack. When you look at 9/11, all three things happened simultaneously. The enemy was highly motivated. They had the weapons, the airplanes, and they had the opportunity, which was the poorly guarded airports. Now, various countries, various cultures put a different emphasis on this triangle. For example, in the United States, the emphasis is on the smoking gun approach. You're looking for the weapons. You can't really convict a person based on intentions. You have to have a proof. We call it the smoking gun approach. In countries like Iran and North Korea, they're focusing on preventing the enemy from having the opportunity. So we call them the police states, right? They send scores of agents to the streets, and they say, yes, we understand there are people out there that are highly motivated in harming us. They may even have the weapons, but what we can do is prevent them from having the opportunity. Now, Israel is one of the unique cases in the world that based its entire security philosophy on the ability to identify motivations. And Israel is able also, because of our history, because of the unprecedented number of threats that we faced over the course of this last several decades, Israel is also capable of punishing people just for their intentions. So when they looked at now you translate this into the Iran deal. The United States under Obama and John Kerry wanted to prevent the Iranians from producing the bomb. Because again, in the eyes of the Americans, the most important thing in this triangle is to prevent your enemy from achieving the capability of attacking you. Israelis didn't like the agreement because it did not address the motivation of the Iranian regime. So the Israelis said, yes, wonderful, you're limiting the ability of the Iranians to enrich uranium to an operational level. But what about their intentions? What about what they're doing with conventional weapons? What about what they might do with chemical and biological weapons? So it's not just about the nuclear, it's about trying to get rid of this regime. And the Americans said, no, this is not the mandate. This is not what we're going to do here. We're here to prevent or to delay the process of the Iranians. So they said, okay, we're going to give you 10, 15 years of limitations, but then after that, you're free to go. That's basically, if you read the agreement, that's what's in the agreement. And the Israelis said, well, we can't live with that. An agreement that does not address the values that the Iranian leadership stands for, we can't accept that. And that's really at the core of now, if you ask me personally, I think the Iranians may be radical, but they're not stupid. I don't think that the Iranians are going to engage in any kind of nuclear confrontation with Israel, because they know the consequence. And I think they know it very well, perhaps better than any other country. And so they may be radical, but they're not stupid and certainly not suicidal.
So just to wrap this up, we in America we're so polarized now, and we're divided into very clear political camps. There's an impression that, well, if you're a Republican, you have problems with the JCPOA. If you're a Democrat, then you want to avoid international conflict, and this is a good thing. And the Israelis, darn them, they're always inclined to be supporting Republicans. And so you're suggesting that there's more to it when it comes to the JCPOA, that there are real security, existential challenges in Israel that incline, and across the board, there are always going to be people who disagree, but basically a consensus in the political and the security establishment that this is a bad deal for Israel.
It's a philosophical debate about national security. Israeli national security has a different philosophy. Israelis are willing to profile people, which you can't do because of the Constitution. Israelis are willing to punish people just for their intentions, which you can't do legally in America. So entirely two different approaches to security. When you go through the airport in New York, they look through your bags, they're looking for the weapon. There's a legal reason for it. In Israel, when you arrive at the airport and they ask you those three questions, they already have 90% of the information they need to have. It's before you arrive. It's an entirely different approach. And so Israelis are concerned with motivation. Americans are concerned with weapons. This is the difference.
So one more question in this regard. Looking at the future of the talks, it's complicated under any circumstances, and the outcome is not guaranteed in any way. But do you think it's the American and the European approach simply to restore what was agreed upon in 2015, or do you think there's substance behind the spokespeople of the administration that they want to improve the JCPOA?
I think what we will see is more of the same. The Iranians lied to the international community all along. They still maintain falsely that the purpose of the program is to produce energy, which is baloney. And so they lied. The international community knows that they're lying. And what you will have at the end, the Iranians are buying more time. You'll just end up with the same result. An Iranian regime that is interested in the exportation of the Islamic Revolution and its values throughout the Muslim and the Arab world, and even in countries in Latin America that have nothing to do with the Arab or the Muslim world, just have a large Arab and Muslim diaspora like Uruguay and Argentina and so on. And they'll continue to steer trouble and to destabilize regimes all over the world. They were involved and still are involved in Syria, in Bahrain, in other places, in Yemen, in Sudan. We see their fingerprints and footprints all over the place. So what you will have, I'm sad to say, that in this case, I think that the Israelis probably have a more accurate view of what's happening in the Middle East. And I don't really think that diplomacy in this case is going to produce the results that that President Biden and his team are looking for. I really believe that what we need to do now is maybe not to. I don't think that there's a military solution, but certainly an economic solution to it, and I think that's the way to go. That's my opinion.
So this leads me to a general discussion about the bilateral relationship with the United States under the Biden administration. What do you think? What's changed? How is the relationship going to go?
So I think I mentioned it last time we spoke. President Biden, perhaps after George Herbert Walker Bush, is the most experienced person to enter the White House from a governmental point of view. He has tens of years of experience as legislator, then 8 years as vice president, and of course, he knows the ins and outs and Washington D.C. and that made him a very knowledgeable person when it comes to Israel. And not to mention the fact that he knows personally every Israeli leader in the last 35, 40 years, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I think that President Biden, without going into other examples of past presidents, I think he has a very good understanding of Israel's needs. And I can tell you as an Israeli, as a former Israeli diplomat, I sleep well at night. I'm not worried about, I don't think that Israel is going to be surprised by President Biden in any way, shape, or form. That's my opinion. And now, in terms of the system, there's always a gap between the perception of the relationship between the leaders themselves and then the systems. The Israeli and the American system have always worked very, very well together. There's a great deal of intimacy, and I'm surprised every time when I hear about things that are happening, how deeper it gets every time. And I have to say that the current level of intimacy between the systems, especially the security systems, is unprecedented. It's just phenomenal.
So let me just ask you one general question. We're rapidly running out of time. I wanted to ask you a series of questions about the relationship between the new administration and the Israeli government on the question of the Palestinians. But generally, if you can relate to that and also tell us, where does this stand? Is it even accurate nowadays to talk about a quote peace process? Are the parties even interested in pursuing the Oslo Accords, or the Oslo Accords dead? I mean, after all, if Netanyahu was out of the way and you were to form a government, it would be a center-right government that would have pretty deep skepticism about the Palestinians and the possibility of reaching an agreement. So future tensions with the Americans under the new administration, and where does this whole thing stand in Israel in any case?
So I don't think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a top priority for the U.S. administration, at least not like it used to be under Clinton or under George W. Bush or even under Obama. I really don't think so. And the reason, of course, these are domestic American reasons. You have bigger fish to fry, as you say here. And so having said that, doesn't mean that we should neglect it. So several things we should mention. The first is Mahmoud Abbas, known as Abu Mazen, it looks like he's about to step down. And we should give him credit for two things. The first is he mainstreamed the approach of nonviolence in the Palestinian society. He was the first leader of the Palestinian national movement to advocate nonviolence. That should not be taken lightly. Secondly, under Mahmoud Abbas, the level of cooperation between the Israeli security and the Palestinian security in the West Bank has been unprecedented. He should get credit for those two things. He should not get credit for advancing the process. In diplomacy, you have to be pragmatic. If David Ben-Gurion was a maximalist, if his understanding of diplomacy was zero-sum, like Mahmoud Abbas's understanding of diplomacy, there would be no state of Israel today. We have a state of Israel only because Ben-Gurion's understanding of diplomacy was that it's not a zero-sum game. That it's not my gain is your loss by definition. That there is actually a way to let pragmatism prevail. And so Mahmoud Abbas could have had major diplomatic achievements by now if he had been a little bit more pragmatic. And so the maximalist view we call it intransigence, the reluctance to receive any kind of compromise, probably will be his legacy. And so, having said that, yes, the Oslo Accords as a practical roadmap is dead, but the Oslo Accords gave us two things that are still with us and I think are very important. The first is the Oslo Accords gave us the mutual recognition. So now, people tend to forget that before 1993, Israel did not even recognize the Palestinians, and the Palestinians did not even recognize the state of Israel. So now we're talking. Even now we're talking. A lot of people think we don't, but we are. The IDF is in communications with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank on a daily basis, happening. And I can go on and give you examples of how this affects the economy in the West Bank and so on. The other thing that the Oslo Accords gave us is the understanding that Israel has to, it's like the relationship between the United States and Mexico. If Mexico has a problem, America has a problem. And that's the second thing that happened as a result of Oslo. Israelis became more mentally attuned to what is happening in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it's true that due to several strategic mistakes made by the Palestinian leadership, it's the issue of Palestinian statehood is pretty much off the table in the Israeli public discussion. Still, if you ask the Israelis, what is your preferred solution? There will be a clear majority, even among right of center Israelis, clear majority that supports the two-state solution, realizing that the one-state solution is not really a solution. It will be the end of the state of Israel as we know it. So I think that's where we are. And again, I don't anticipate that the current U.S. administration is going to invest too much energy or time on the Palestinian issue, and they have other issues to worry about.
So we have time for one more question, Nido, if I can ask you. You've been a diplomat here. You spend a lot of time here. You teach here. You an analyst of not only the United States, but also the role of world Jewry and American Jewry. So tell us why you think, from your years of experience and from what you understand now, why do you think the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, in particular American Jewry, is important? Why is it important for Judaism, for the Jewish people? Why is it important for Israel? And what do you think how do you think Israelis view this relationship?
So first of all, Israelis in the back of their minds see themselves as part of America. And again, I mentioned David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion was the prime minister who made that strategic decision back in the 1950s, early 1960s, to side with the United States in the Cold War, which was not an obvious decision. There were many Israelis in the leadership and in the army even that wanted to side with the Soviets, that thought Israel should bet on the Soviets. So in the back of our minds, we see ourselves as an extension of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that Americans see Israel as an extension of the United States, but this is how Israelis feel about America. That's the first thing. Secondly, United States, there's been a lot of talk about the decline of the United States. In my view, the Israelis are perhaps the most knowledgeable society when it comes to the United States, especially when it comes to New York. Israelis have a very special relationship with New York, and Israelis know that the United States is the only place that matters. Why? Because the United States is the #1 producer of knowledge in the world today. American popular culture is in many ways the universal popular culture. Even American language, when you look at the internet, what is the language of the internet today? It's American English. It's not British English, certainly not Chinese. So Israelis understand that if they want to study, they have to come to America if they want. So that gives us a tremendous opportunity. And I can back that with facts. Zionism, which was never a big hit among American Jews, has never been more popular in the United States than it is today, largely thanks to programs like Birthright, like the programs that you do at the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue, taking groups to Israel, like all the summer programs, the Alexander Muss High School, all those wonderful programs allow Americans to experience Israel firsthand. And then you have all the scores of Israelis like myself. When I was a young man, I came to America to study. I didn't go to Paris. I went to America to get my second degree. Like me, there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis that come to America, interact with American Jews. I have to tell you, my Jewish education, Rabbi, I think I said this to you once before. I had my Jewish education right here in America. I didn't have my Jewish education in Israel because in Israel, people take it for granted that they're Jews. In America, you have to work hard to be Jewish. It's also very expensive to be Jewish. And I think more and more Israelis like me are beginning to realize that. So the relationship are more balanced today than they used to be when I was a kid. When I was a kid, it was American was the giving party, American Jewry was the giving party, Israel was the receiving party, and that was it. And it's no longer the case. Today is, it's about a dialogue, it's about an interaction, and social media is allowing people to do that very, very intensely. And I see it every day. I really see it every day. And I think that there would be no state of Israel without the support of American Jewry and world Jewry. Everybody knows that. And today, I think the relationship are far more normal and more balanced, if I may use that term.
So on that optimistic note, Ido, this is the second of 2 hours that we've spent together. I know that you and I and our community will be in touch with you in the months and years ahead. Just want to thank you for your generosity of spirit and your generosity of time and sharing your views with us. And I want to say again, on behalf of our community, what I said to you 3 weeks ago, which is your term of service here was phenomenal, and we deeply appreciate. I say this on behalf of our synagogue, the Reform movement, that I was a part of the leadership corps, as well as on behalf of American Jewry. Thank you so much for who you are, what you did, and what you'll continue to do. With that, I hand it over to our president.
Well, I'll just reiterate what the rabbi said. We really appreciate your joining us. You provide so much insight, and we hope that you'll come back again. That maybe this can be a regular thing. We all learn so much. Spending an hour with you is incredible. To our viewers, I hope you enjoyed our program. And finally, I just want to mention 2 items. First, I really want to encourage any listeners who are not members of our synagogue to consider making a contribution, or better yet, joining us. And second, I wanted to let you know that in early June, Professor Casey Johnson will be presenting on the subject of the key presidential transitions and the changing nature of the U.S. Israeli relationship. He's going to explore the 1960, 1980, and 2016 elections. It looks very, very interesting, and I'm looking forward to it. With that, thank you again, and everyone be safe and be well.